learning, but we don't assess it because it's not essential to know. So we do include it, but we don't assess it. An example of that is the story about how Columbus, if you recall, he wasn't from Spain, he was from Genoa, and how he went to the king of Genoa to get funds for that first trip, and he was sort of pitching that idea, but the king wouldn't bite. And so then he went to the royal court in Portugal, and he tried to get them to fund his trip, and they wouldn't fund it either. So Columbus rewrote his grant and sent it to Spain, or he takes the idea to Spain, and of course they funded his trip. Now that's an interesting story, and kids love hearing that story, and so I do include it in instruction, but I don't assess it because it's not particularly essential that kids remember that story. The third level is all the specialized knowledge or trivia. And essentially, this is stuff that a few kids are going to learn this stuff, and essentially on their own or through enrichment activities and things of that nature. This is stuff that you simply do not teach because you don't have time to teach everything. And if you think about it, you have a choice between teaching trivia that's not essential to know and using that time to teach the trivia, or using that same time to focus on core ideas of the curriculum and teaching that really intensely. And what we tend to do is focus on the trivia and hope kids figure out the core idea. So what we're talking about doing is eliminating a lot of the trivia. Don't teach it, and certainly not test it. Now, examples of trivia would be the names of those 3 ships. The fact that Martin Pizon was the captain of the Pinta and which ship sank. This is all trivia that's in the book, all the kind of trivia that tends to find its way into our kids' tests. Now, just to be clear about what we're talking about here, what's not differentiating the curriculum is a situation where kids who memorize the most trivia get A's, and those who memorize some trivia get B's and C's. And those who memorize the least trivia get D's and F's. Likewise, what's also not differentiating the curriculum is the notion that, well, the kids who get the big ideas and the trivia get A's, and those who just learn trivia get B's and C's. And of course, those who memorize the least trivia get D's and F's. And what's definitely not differentiating the curriculum is the basic approach, whereas if you learn this much, you get a C, and if you learn this much, you get a B, and if you learn this much of the regular curriculum, you get an A, while at the same time you provide this alternative, dumbed-down curriculum for kids with learning problems, where if they learn this much of the dumbed-down curriculum, they get an A, and this much a B, and this much of the dumbed-down curriculum a C. So in essence, differentiating the curriculum is one of the ways to relieve some of the pressure. The other is providing robust instruction. So what I mean by robust instruction, first of all, it's the kind of teaching that's powerful enough to impact kids with learning problems. We know from our research that when teachers use these kinds of teaching tactics and tools, that kids with learning problems really benefit and tend to master the curriculum. Likewise, these are the same tools that our research shows are also very effective with normal and high-achieving students as well. Another notion of robust instruction is that these tools focus on developing in kids a sense of relational understanding of how ideas are related or tie together, rather than memorizing a whole bunch of details and trivia. Key focus is on helping kids make connections among big ideas and core ideas and getting them to elaborate on these connections. In essence, understanding how all of these ideas hang together. Another key feature is making the organization of the stuff kids are supposed to learn more self-evident to them, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Now, the frame is an example of one of the Make Sense tools, and so we're going to take a look at how that might be applied. You can use it to differentiate the curriculum so the focus is on big ideas, and it also works well across grades and across curriculum areas. So now we're going to focus on part 2, and that's the frame. What's important to keep in mind as we look at this frame is that this is a powerful device to help organize information that kids are supposed to learn, and likewise help kids learn how to organize information. It's also really good for facilitating elaborating to learn, and likewise learning how to elaborate. So we'll take a look at the frame. In essence, the frame is a typographic organizer that's designed to make the information that kids are supposed to learn more obvious to them. But why is this so important? First of all, in order to understand a complex topic, the learner has to figure out how it's organized. And so the more complex the topic, the harder it is to determine its organization. Likewise, graphic organizers make the organization self-evident even before the new information is presented. So for an example, if you pretend for a moment we're getting ready to teach a lesson and I could use either a web or a Venn diagram, both you're familiar with those formats, you know before I even teach the lesson how that information is going to be organized. So it's self-evident before it's presented. And because if you know how the information is organized, you don't have to work as hard to understand it. As a result, you can teach at more complex levels, which provides a very nice alternative to dumbing down the curriculum. So what we're going to do is actually take a look at the frame, and I'm going to introduce the parts of the frame first, and then in a few minutes I'm going to share with you some applications of it. Essentially, the top of the frame has something called the key topic and is about statement. The key topic, as you might guess, is the topic of your lesson. The is about statement is essentially the gist of what the whole thing's about, captures the essence of the whole lesson. Then what the frame has is a section where we identify what are the main ideas of the lesson. Now this example shows three, and of course they're not always three main ideas. Sometimes there's only one, and sometimes there are more than three. For each main idea, what we do is list the essential details that are really important to remember. Now remember, our lesson is going to contain more than essential details. We're going to be including all the stuff that's really interesting to kids, but not essential. Only the stuff that we're listing on the frame is just the really important stuff that we expect kids to remember about each main idea. One of the ways of viewing essential details is what are those details that if they don't get this detail, their understanding of the main idea is going to be erroneous. Okay? Those are the things we list as essential details. Finally, at the bottom of the frame, we have something called a so what statement. What's really important to understand about this whole thing. It can be an overall summary, it can be a connection to some real-world context or a problem to be understood or solved. It can be a metaphor or a simile related to the topic. It can also be like a basic life truth or a generative idea. Now here's an example of a frame done on a lesson about important lessons that changed society as a result of the Titanic thinking. And if you look at this, at the top basically what you have is whole, and then it shifts to understanding the parts, and at the bottom back to whole. So this is a very effective model of teaching, and that is whole to part, back to whole. Remember, a common mistake we tend to make is we focus on all the parts and we assume kids will figure out what the whole is. Some teachers use a technique called blanks for key words when they're using the frame. Here what they've done is develop the frame ahead of time, and then in each section provided a blank for the most important word for that section to be listed by the student. That way they don't have to write the whole thing. This can be really effective when you have kids with writing problems or it takes them forever to write down stuff, and it will allow them to sort of keep up with the notes without having to take everything. But generally, I don't like to use this technique because it puts kids in a passive learning mode. Essentially what happens is the emphasis of instruction shifts from trying to understand what this whole thing is about and what's really important about it to what goes in that blank and how do you spell it. And so it can sort of shift instruction away from what's really important. An approach for using these frames that we have found to be really effective really involves 4 phases of instruction. In the first phase, we call I do it, and here when you're first introducing the frame to students, and they really haven't seen one before, what we strongly recommend is that you develop one in advance. It's really well organized, and just give kids a copy of the whole thing and walk them through it just like you'd walk them through an outline, if you will. If you do this once or twice, and then you can move straight on into the second phase of instruction, and this is what we call we do it. Now with we do it instruction,